I'm going to show you a wonderful attacking game played by the young Boris Spassky in his first ever Soviet championship. I spotted this game in this book, Beyond Material by Davorin Kulyasevich. I just reviewed it, perhaps you saw that video. Really excellent book, and I have to say that I hadn't seen this game of Spassky's before, and it is a real treat. So this is the 18-year-old Boris Spassky playing with the black pieces against Vladimir Simagin. In 1955, Spassky's first ever Soviet championship, and he was actually equal third, an extraordinary performance. Spassky was a real prodigy. He had to work very hard in order to get to the very top, and only became world champion in 1969, but he was marked out as an extraordinary talent at this young age. So we've got a kind of reti that white is playing, and Spassky has really set up with a very classical method development, occupying the centre with his pawns and playing the knights out to their best squares. So very straightforward. And Simagin plays a3, so he's got a particular idea in mind. Basically, he's going for an isolated queen's pawn position with d4. Now it starts to look a little bit more normal. But the point is that after this exchange, there's no check on b4. That's why a3 was played. But Spassky playing, as I said, very classically, very straightforward way. And now you could put your knight on e4 straight away and play bishop f6. That's not bad. But Spassky puts the bishop on this diagonal, the attacking diagonal. So we have an absolutely typical isolated queen's pawn position. I really like playing with an isolated queen's pawn, but it's a matter of taste. White's position is absolutely fine. But I like the space that it gives you when you have an IQP. And yeah, it means there are open diagonals here. And it just gives you some room to maneuver with your pieces. Spassky played a very interesting idea now here with black. I mean, I think I would just play rook e8 here very quickly. Just put the rook here. But instead, Spassky took on d4 and then played bishop f5. Now, it's a little bit unusual just to exchange so quickly here, because white has really undisputed control over that square. But actually, the idea was to bring this bishop to a good diagonal, and certainly is a good diagonal. And after white castled, to play rook c8. So in this way, Spassky gets some control here, actually. White can't play rook c1 at the moment to challenge, because if rook c1, then, of course, the a-pawn could be taken. So he's just exploiting the fact that this pawn has advanced one square. And here's Simagin. Well, he's a very creative player. He plays rook a2, which covers the c2 square and makes room for the queen to come into the corner. And now Spassky drops the bishop back to b8. So queen a1 sets up a battery on this diagonal. And queen d6, so that's the idea of bishop b8. So mate threatened on h2, and so now g3 blocks the diagonal, but of course will allow that bishop to come into h3. Knight f3, and bishop h3 attacks the rook here, which moves to the side, rook e1. And here is a crunch moment in the game. White looks to be pretty strongly placed on the king side with those pawns, and the minor pieces are pretty well set up. How should black make progress against that? Spassky comes up with a great idea, and this was featured in Kulyasevich's book Beyond Material. very creative from Spassky and very, very straightforward. You know, there's something that's, you know, when I see Spassky's games, for example, in the King's Gambit, or, well, lots of different openings actually, it's kind of straight on, straight ahead. The knight comes to this beautiful outpost on e4. That's where you want it when you play an IQP position, because it looks at so many key points in the enemy position. Particularly after the rook has moved to f1, it looks at f2. And that means that the queen can sweep over to this side of the board as well. And now white could play carefully with knight d2 to exchange off that knight, but instead, well, he picked up the gauntlet and played bishop takes g7. Well, that's an important pawn that's gone in front of black's king. But queen g6 was, of course, the prepared riposte, attacking the bishop, but also you can see lining up on that g3 pawn. And if the bishop retreats here, then in fact bishop takes g3 is a winning move. So bishop e5 looks pretty normal to just exchange off that bishop, so there's no longer a sacrifice possible on g3. So what next? Well, this was also obviously prepared and foreseen by Spassky before he sacrificed the pawn on g7. He exchanged on e5 and played queen f5. Attacking the knight, attacking the pawn on f2. So really, there are a couple of choices for white here. I should say if the knight comes back here, then bishop g4 is awkward. But white can choose between f4, defending the knight, no threat to f2, or the knight can drop back to d3, and this was highlighted by Kuliasevich, and he recommended here knight d3 with the idea simply of giving up the exchange like this. And white certainly has compensation here because that knight is rock solid, covers key squares, and you never know, white on a good day may be able to seize the initiative and perhaps swing that queen across to attack on the king's side. I mean, the position is still very, very unclear. You know, black's pieces are still pretty good. But instead white played f4, which is very risky. I've often spoken about this weakness that some players have of advancing the f-pawn. Means there's no cover on the second rank, means the e3 pawn is weaker. Of course, Simagin was a strong player, he knew all that, but he thought he could get away with it. Well, let's see what happened. Pawn to f6, attacking the knight. The knight came back to f3. Knight c3. Now things are looking critical. Rook is attacked. The knight is also looking at the bishop, but rook takes pawn is a threat. And this is already pretty dire for white. So knight h4. But this was Simagin's idea. He'd calculated what he thought was a clever defense. The knight comes to h4, attacking the queen, which drops back to e6. Bishop h5 attacks the rook, but also means the rook is now defending the pawn on e3. But Spassky had seen a move further. Knight takes rook. And after bishop takes rook, well, Simagin was hoping that this would just be recaptured and then he can take here and it's just about okay. But instead, Spassky played this move, rook c1, and that was game over. If rook takes rook, then queen takes pawn check, and knight takes rook, and then there's going to be mate here. I mean, this is a wonderful example of centralization and how pieces can be sidelined, and that was really the theme that Kuliasevich was highlighting. Misplaced pieces which are beautifully exploited. After rook c1, I should say that the game ended queen takes rook. Knight takes queen. The bishop came back, but, well, in this position, black has a queen against a rook advantage, and, well, there's more trouble to come because that bishop is in some trouble as well. So, yeah, white resigned here. Wonderful game by Spassky. As I said, I really like the kind of clear-cut approach he took, not just with the sacrifice of the pawn, but actually if we come back to this position straight out of the opening, this idea to exchange here and play bishop f5. And then, yes, a wonderful pawn sacrifice with knight e4. Very well calculated, but I'm sure a lot of this was on feel as well. And he had simply seen further than his opponent at the end. So, well, this game got me looking back through lots of old games by Boris Spassky. So I'm going to start a short series of Boris Spassky's games. It's going to be pretty random, just my selection. But anyway, that'll be coming in the next few days. Thanks for watching.